Hello, I'm Rick, and I'm the admin for this talk. And it's by Derek Littell, who is the host of the Hellenistic Age Podcast.
My name is Derek Littell. I'm the host and creator of the Hellenistic Age Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about my presentation is titled To the Strongest, the Collapse of Alexander the Great's Empire. So the conquest of Alexander and the meteoric rise of the Macedonian Empire was a dramatic time in world history, but its collapse was no less spectacular. Many tend to focus on Alexander's military achievements, but his imperial ambitions seem to not have lasted long beyond his own death. Today, we'll be discussing the various factors as to why the Macedonian Empire collapsed so quickly, and I'm actually taking a pretty critical approach to a topic that normally I come from a more positive aspect, but I'd be happy to address any questions towards the end, but I hope you enjoy. So let's kick it off here. A bit of background. Of course, Alexander the Great, we all know and love him or hate him, depending on your point of view. The invasion of the Persian Empire begins 2 years into Alexander's career, taking him from the modern state of Bulgaria all the way to the Punjab over a period of about 10 years before being forced to turn back by a mutiny of his troops at the Hyphasis River. Now, he was forced to return back to Babylon in 324 and was now the master of the largest empire in the known world. Though the king had ambitions for further conquests, he would actually die of unknown causes on June the 11th of 323 BC, at the age of only about 32 and a half years old. Almost immediately, his empire would break apart into a series of civil wars known as the Wars of the Successors, which saw the birth of the Hellenistic world, as each of the three main dynasties would claim their piece. The Seleucids in Asia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and then finally the Antigonids in Macedonia. Meanwhile, Alexander's own family would become extinct. The rapid collapse of this empire needs to be inspected in closer detail, as many of its issues were plaguing it before his own death, which was probably the catalyst of the scenario, but let's look at around here. The unexpected death of Alexander is one of the great mysteries of antiquity and was really the catalyst for his empire's collapse. Of course, diseases such as malaria and typhus, or even accusations of poisoning, have been put forward to explain how the seemingly invincible king died at such a young age. Of course, diagnosis is impossible, but perhaps it is more surprising that Alexander had lived as long as he really did. Being a king has its perks, of course, but it was a remarkably dangerous position. Competition was fierce among the Macedonian nobility. Plots and assassinations were pretty much part and parcel of the experience. Alexander's own father, Philip, was murdered in such a fashion, and Alexander himself faced plots during his campaigns, such as the conspiracy of the Pages while in Central Asia, or Iran, excuse me. Now, as well, Macedonian monarchies required the king to place himself on the front line of combat to set an example for his men. Even by the standards of that time period, Alexander was exceptionally reckless, or brave, or reckless, depending on your point of view. We have a laundry list of his injuries, both major and minor, that he suffered throughout his conquest of Persia. The most famous of these was a chest wound from an arrow he received along the Indus River. This almost certainly collapsed a lung and almost killed him outright. This would have been a lingering injury that probably weakened his overall constitution and opened him up to further potential complications from other injuries or from a disease, it might be the case. He was also a heavy drinker, which he's not unlike his contemporaries. I mean, claiming alcoholism is a bit of a question, but it probably didn't help his overall health. So, I mean, if you look at his overall career and the many, many close calls he had, luck and skill had saved Alexander's bacon more than once. But the king showed no signs of slowing down with his campaigns abroad. With his nagging injuries and harsh lifestyle, I really doubt that he would have lived long enough to ensure his empire's long-term stability. And even if somebody had it in for him in terms of poisoning or whatever it may be, I think he was on borrowed time, and maybe he knew it as well. So, given the lifestyle of Alexander as a king, he was going to have a successor in place just in case he kicked the bucket early. And now we all can almost universally agree that one of the first things a new monarch should do is to secure a legitimate heir. In the case of this period in general, for most of human history, it would be a male. Unfortunately, Alexander neglected to do this before he headed out on his Persian conquest. And at the time of his death, there were few competent candidates to take the throne. Polygamy, of course, was an accepted practice of Macedonian kings. Philip II, his father, had about 7 wives and an equal amount of children. Alexander had only in quotations, 3 wives, and only one of them produced a child that would be considered legitimate. So let's kind of name the 3 main candidates upon his death. The first is Alexander IV. This is the son of Alexander and his main wife, Roxana of Bactria, a noblewoman from what is now essentially Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. At the time of Alexander's death, Roxana was in her 2nd or 3rd trimester. The child was born a few months later, but at the time, there was no way of testing or telling what sex the child would be. So at that point, it was a gamble if it could be a son or a prince, a daughter. It was completely unknown. Ultimately, he proved to be a boy. Even then, he quickly became a pawn in the political game of the successors, such being the fate of many child emperors and kings who placed on the throne at such a young age. And eventually, in 310, at the city of Amphipolis, he was murdered alongside his mother by the orders of Cassander of Macedon, who was supposedly kind of keeping them under his protection. So tragic little life, not much we know about Alexander himself. So with that out of the way, second person, Heracles. This is the son of Alexander and a noblewoman named Barsine. She was a Persian noblewoman, a former wife of the general he had faced. This is a bit more questionable. We do know Heracles was real. At the time, he would have been about 3 to 4 years old, but his paternal relation with Alexander is controversial. We're not really sure if he actually is Alexander's son. Most of the successors did not view him as such, though he may have been used as a pawn in these games and would continue to do so. His questionable legitimacy as a bastard was a hard sell for many, but eventually he was still used as in part of the political games until about 309, when he too was murdered as well. Now, that kind of sums it up for Alexander's biological children, but maybe there's another option. Philip III Aridaeus. This is actually Alexander's sole surviving half-brother, a flesh and blood son of Philip II, who was of adult age in Babylon at the time of Alexander's death. Now, these sort of collateral successions are not uncommon for a lot of monarchies. And in this case, if we're having an adult would be probably a smart idea. Unfortunately, almost all of these sources seem to indicate that Philip III was mentally incapable of ruling. Whether that means he has had some sort of mental disability, whether it's be epilepsy or if it's actually intellectually disabled, we don't really know. But clearly they all consider them unfit for rule by himself. He was quickly taken over by pawns and, again, the games of these other ministers. And actually his wife, Eurydice, wore the proverbial pants in the relationship, and she would actually command armies in his name. But both her and him would be murdered in 317 on the orders of Alexander's mother, Olympias. Now, conception is often complicated by genetic and environmental factors. Alexander seemed to take little interest in actually securing a line of succession before the invasion of Persia. Now, had he taken a wife in 336, right before he was about to leave, and produced an heir, that child would have been about 13 years old in 323. It's not an ideal situation, but on the Argead throne, that would have been a far better claim and perhaps ensured the dynasty's long-term survival. So if we have problems at the very top of the hierarchy, let's look at the administration that could maybe mitigate those issues. Alexander inherited the system put in place by the Persian Empire, and he did little to adjust it. Satraps overruled the satrapies or provinces. Babylon became the new capital of his cosmopolitan empire. While the Achaemenids were able to hold on to things together for more or less about 200 years, there were also significant problems plaguing it before Alexander's arrival, and would continue to do so. The enormous size of the empire, extending from the Balkans to the Punjab, was a significant problem to overcome. The limitations of communication and transportation technology meant that Alexander was going to have a hard time responding to crises, and it was a very cumbersome process, especially for those frontier zones. Many of the newly acquired territories in the east were extremely unstable, such as his Bactrian and Indian satrapies, all the way on the far right of the map here, where native revolts and the assassination of his own officials were taking place. He was going to have to rely on his satraps to act in his stead, but the degree of power these men held often led to corruption, and sometimes Alexander's own trust could be misplaced. In 324, when Alexander had returned from the east and was now in the region of Mesopotamia, he had executed a number of individual or officials who were convicted of embezzlement and abuse of the locals during his absence. In one famous instance, Harpalus, a childhood friend of Alexander and appointed treasurer who stole thousands of silver talents, that's about billions and billions of dollars in today's money, he spent it on courtesans and luxuries and was actually caught by the king, but he was pardoned on the count of their past friendship. Now, as soon as Alexander left, Harpalus did it once again. But when Alexander began to return to the west towards Babylon, Harpalus fled the city, took a boatload of cash and mercenaries, and then sailed to Greece, where he was assassinated, and all that was lost. In Egypt, Cleomenes of Naucratis was actually ruthlessly taxing the Egyptians any way he could and pocketed all the leftover money for his own gain. It did not send it back to Babylon or put into the imperial treasury. He too was murdered by another man named Ptolemy, who probably a name you do recognize, but that was after Alexander's death. Clearly, if Alexander was to ensure that his conquests weren't ephemeral, a few years of consolidation and reorganization would have been absolutely essential. Unfortunately, according to the so-called last plans, there doesn't seem to be any indication that Alexander actually intended to stop his conquests in the immediate sense. An expedition to Arabia was already underway at the time of his death, and it was probably quite possible that he was going to head west into North Africa after that conquest and maybe target Carthage. Considering how fragile the situation was in the east, adding more territory could have strained the system, especially without an heir to act as a co-ruler. So the administrative and ruling body clearly has issues, but there's also issues with the actual makeup of the empire. To clarify here, if you look at the title, I firmly believe that Macedonians are a part of the larger Greek family. But the Macedonians themselves believed and were perceived by their southern Greek neighbors as distinct entities. Maybe like a good comparison would be like a Texan distinguishing himself from a New Yorker in America. There's this regional factionalism. The rise of the Macedonian hegemony had left a lot of bad blood after the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 between the Peloponnesian Greeks and their northern neighbors. For example, as expressed by the anti-Macedonian firebrand Demosthenes on the left, who loudly criticized Philip and Alexander in his so-called Philippics. Though Alexander had declared his invasion of Persia to be a pan-Hellenic movement, there were several instances of the Greeks fighting back against Macedonian domination. Starting off in 335, we have the destruction of Thebes, the famous city of Thebes, for attempting to revolt. A few years later, King August of Sparta led a Persian-funded army against the standing region of Macedonia named Antipater that was eventually destroyed near Megalopolis. It is actually no exaggeration to suggest that more Greeks fought on the side of the great king of Persia than they did for Alexander. And during these engagements, such as at the Granicus and Issus, these Greeks would have a final stand and were given no quarter by Alexander, who viewed them as traitors. But clearly there was this hostility between one another. Now, Alexander did employ mercenaries, and part of his colonial policy was to take several of these Greeks and settle them into the frontier territories, namely in Bactria and Sogdiana in modern Central Asia. This was in part to control native rebellions, which were pretty frequent in the area, but at the same time, it also allowed him to control the untrustworthy mercenaries and keep them away from the Greek cities of the Mediterranean. These colonists had rebelled in 326 when rumor of Alexander's death in India had spread. And when it finally proved true in 323, about 23,000 Greek mercenaries marched back towards the Mediterranean, intending to get back home, but were intercepted by a Macedonian force and were killed. Lastly, there was also when Alexander died, Rhodes had ultimately expelled its Macedonian garrison, became an independent state. And in the Lemnian War, which was the final last chance of the Greeks to reclaim their freedom from Macedonian hegemony, they had failed, and those like Demosthenes ended up committing suicide rather than being captured. This hegemony would not be destroyed until the arrival of the Romans, but clearly this sort of tension between Greek and Macedonian was not something that was going to be settled in the immediate, and was plaguing Alexander during his campaign. So I'm curious to see how it would have continued onwards afterwards. There was also resentment among the Macedonians themselves. As a ruler of a cosmopolitan empire where Macedonians were now a small minority, Alexander had begun to take the role of the great king, and in some sense might be viewed as the last Achaemenid ruler of Persia. This involved the adoption of customs and clothing more suited to the role, but to some of his officers and to many of his foot soldiers, it came across quite poorly. The Persians were, after all, effete and decadent and were the enemy. Now we have Alexander taking on these traits. Most controversial of these was what we call proskynesis. This is a formal gesture of politeness by Persians to leaders and officials, such as this relief from Persepolis, which shows a kind of a polite bow. But the Greeks viewed it as an act of servitude befitting slaves. There was their common belief that all the subjects of the great king were slaves, and to the Greeks that was viewed as abhorrent. And now here's Alexander doing his thing. As well, oops, sorry about that. Oh, there we go. Soon Alexander began to supplement his army with Asian troops, which wasn't inherently a problem and probably did him more favors, but it soon became an issue when he trained Persian youths into the Macedonian pike phalanx, a position of honor that directly challenged his veterans' status. Alexander's attempts to wed the many noble officers of his company with noblewomen from Persia ended in failure. For example, the weddings of Susa was a mass marriage, and all but approximately one or two of them kept their Persian wives, namely Seleucus and Apama. That experiment failed, and he also had an increased emphasis as being the son of Zeus Ammon, as opposed to Philip II, the man that forged Macedon into the powerhouse of Greece, that kind of took him from goat herders to lords of over the peninsula, and it left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. There were some outbreaks of rebellion against this. The troops already mutinied once at the Hyphasis River in 326, which prevented Alexander from marching onwards into India. In 324, they mutinied at Opis, again, in protest of the king's apparent orientalizing or Eastern adoption of Eastern customs. While Alexander was able to address some of these concerns, not all of them were clearly resolved. When Alexander had died, the fighting broke out between the infantry and cavalry, so the noblemen versus the peasants, or cavalry or peasants and noblemen. The infantry had favored Philip III, who was the flesh and blood son of Philip. And Alexander IV was viewed as kind of a half-breed, and I'm trying to use what their terms are, half Macedonian, a fraud, and there was a lot of issues, and they too would become another faction in the wars that would tear apart the empire, namely the Silver Shield as one famous example. Now, of course, we must also consider the personalities that were especially responsible for the rapid breakdown of the empire. Perhaps as a testament to his own genius, he had surrounded himself with some of the most talented officers and commanders the ancient world had ever seen. These are known generally as the successors or the Theodohoi in Greek. Names such as Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Antigonus are some of the most colorful personalities of the era. Though tied to Alexander, these men were incredibly ambitious and had formed rivalries during the campaigns. Infighting broke out immediately after the king died, and they began to work against or manipulate the surviving Argead family members for their own ends. So with untold power and riches presented in front of them, the successors would abandon whatever loyalty they had to Alexander's memory and carve out an empire for their own, or a kingdom out of their own, out of the empire. Now, some would come close to reuniting it, but their wars with one another would just devastate many regions like Greece and Babylonia. I mean, Alexander had failed to engender a sense of long-lasting loyalty to these officers that would survive his lifetime. I mean, some of these people were Alexander's childhood friends. Certainly, they would exploit his image and try to draw legitimacy from his name, but they would actively undermine the unity of the empire, manipulate and destroy the surviving members of the Argead dynasty, and work exclusively in their own interests. These are some of the key factors I believe are why Alexander's empire had failed. For all of his military genius, he clearly was not up to the task of maintaining an empire that was to be long-term. If he had lived, it would be one thing, but as I've shown, there were so many factors that imply that he was going to die early. He didn't have a plan in place before he went out for his conquests, the clear tensions in his army among the peoples he ruled. it's just a whole hot mess. And then no wonder that as much as when Alexander declared in one of the sources where Alexander thought a great funeral game was to be set, it may not have been literal. It's just a symbolic term, but the fact is that he clearly was not preparing his successors in the way that would have benefited the Argead dynasty, and as a result, we have the birth of the Hellenistic world. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and I'd like to thank all the people getting intelligent speech together, and I'm happy to field any questions you might have.
Thank you, Derek. That was really good. Very interesting. Like you said, please put any questions in the chat window and we will field them. Just whilst we're waiting for that, it seems like he left a bit of a mess. So do you think that was almost deliberate in a way? Because or so far when he was on his campaigns that he almost enjoyed the thought of there's going to be fighting after and nobody can match him.
That's actually one of the traditions that is put forward. I think I have one of the first lines. It's from Diodorus of Sicily, who compiled a lot of the histories. When one of his friends asked him to whom he leaving his kingdom, he says, "To the strongest."
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a very good way to leave a kingdom, because there's one theory that I think the phrasing in Greek is "hotoi kratistoi." He actually might have meant "hoton krateron," which is like "to Craterus," but it has been misheard. Alexander was larger than life. It absolutely makes perfect sense why his death would be equally as crazy and as large or as mythical. But we know from his illness that he lost the ability to speak shortly afterwards. So I don't know why Diodorus thinks that he was going to be able to talk when all the other sources agree he lost his voice, which is possibly a symptom of paralysis or some sort of complications from whatever disease or poison he may have had. I think it's disease, but there are conspiracy theories. Oh, let me just go ahead and share this again.
What's your opinion on him? Are you a fan or are you not?
Well, I think that Alexander is probably one of the most fascinating people in all of history. I mean, that's an escaping answer. I think there's a lot of traits that especially when you're reading about him being, adolescent to early 20s kind of guy, there's something you can really admire, and you get really wrapped up into the personality and like the sense of scale. I mean, there's factors like people like Napoleon and so many other conquerors in history who look up to him. You can't help but have it rub off on you. But when you do a lot more digging, there is a lot more negative aspects to him where you have to accept as a reality. I mean, clearly, how many people that were suffered at his hands of his army, and as an indirect consequence, this is a dude that essentially led an enormous part of the world into a state of near anarchy for 30, 40 years because his conquests were already destructive. He destroyed the Persian Empire, and then the resulting conflicts after he died and failed to maintain it were as equally chaotic. I mean, the Battle of Ipsus, you had people going from India and Greece fighting in the plains of Turkey. It's truly unbelievable. So I think my perception of him has really hardened, where I'm not as in favor of him, whereas I don't like him as much. But I think there's sort of that romantic element you get in all these primary sources, which you can't help but like. But I think it's reasonable to have your heroes, or not heroes, but people that you enjoy learning about, and still are willing to criticize them. I'm not one of those people who can't tolerate people criticizing people like in history. That's not how it usually works. And I think it's worth addressing his bad side as much as we do his maybe good elements or his good side.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there was any chance of like the empire that he had forged continuing? So I think Ptolemy was probably the most successful, but mainly in Egypt. Do you think anybody would have been able to take on the mantle?
The closest one I think it's a pretty straightforward answer is probably going to be Seleucus. Now, when he had died, he was about to march on to Macedonia and reclaim the kingdom, as he had defeated Lysimachus in the top left over here. He was very close, but then he was murdered, which is about as dramatic or I guess it's almost as anticlimactic as it is dramatic. He had a very good chance. He had taken most of the Asian satrapies. The only thing really missing was Egypt, but over time, I think if they were able to consolidate that territory and march on Egypt, they probably could have taken it. And as we see later on in the Hellenistic period, the other person that would come closest is Antiochus III, who was Seleucus's great 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 grandson. And actually, I'm talking about him right now. But then he met the Romans, which ultimately put a stop to his worldwide ambitions of possibly reuniting Alexander's empire.
Do you think there was any, with the administration of in the Persian Empire and then the Greek lands that he had taken, do you think that they almost plotted against Alexander as well, particularly the Macedonians and Greeks not getting along, so they wanted failure?
I'm sure that every one of these parties had an issue. I guess to clarify, I'm guessing then, are they asking specifically, I guess the Greeks certainly were trying to have Alexander fail. Demosthenes had repeatedly tried to incite his fellow Greeks to rebel while Alexander was gone. As we saw, August had led that rebellion, was backed by Persian wealth. In the East, there was the real problem areas were primarily in Bactria and Sogdiana, and then also India. Bactria and Sogdiana had they had a very hard time where, most of the Persian Empire was conquered in only a few years. That same amount of time was spent in a very small area, just dealing with counter rebellions, counter fighting. So some of the leaders of those rebellions were satraps who had worked for the Persians, most famously Bessus, who had murdered Darius III, the last great king in the Achaemenid, and would actually kickstart the largest rebellion. And I think that everybody at that point thought it as a free-for-all to loot, pillage, take for themselves. The Persian Empire was the wealthiest place in the world at the time. The amount of money that was transferred, plundered, whatever you want to call it, is ridiculous. I think one scholar, Frank Holt, compared it to the Spanish invasion of Mexico and the transfer and the taking of silver from there. Like, that's the only approximation we have. So I imagine that a lot of these people just thought, hey, what can I get out of this, and take it apart? There was so much chaos going on, it was hard to rectify. And Alexander was able to address some of it, but clearly not all of it. And it was a big area to overtake. So again, I think that he had done a lot, but the fact that he was going for more is kind of crazy, and he should have spent more time fixing what he already had.
Yeah, it seems like he's overextending there. Is it true, the story with Caesar, that he cried saying that he had done nothing compared to Alexander as well?
That's what Plutarch says, and I like the one professor, Kenneth Harrell, had said best. If with Plutarch, if it isn't true, it ought to be. I mean, it does strike me as very much a dramatic image where Caesar, for the context, Caesar was in Spain, I believe, and one of his commanderships. He was about 35 or so, and he had stepped in front of a statue of Alexander the Great, fell weeping, and was upset that he felt that he didn't achieve as much. Meanwhile, here, this Macedonian king had conquered the world. Plutarch, for reference, in his biographies, The Lives of Noble Greeks and Romans, paralleled Caesar and Alexander as both the best conquerors, the best generals of each of the Greeks in Rome. Clearly, there was a lot of dramatic elements to this. I mean, I like to think it's true. Clearly, though, Alexander was a model for a lot of Romans who had a love-hate relationship with the guy. I mean, of course, people like Livy really like to Livy, the historian of Augustan Rome, who wrote a history of the Roman Republic. Spends a bit of an aside talking about a hypothetical battle between Alexander and the Roman Republic of the late 3rd century, or late 4th century, excuse me. And he was like, no, Italy would win. We'll take some punches, but Italy's going to win. I'm going to say that's a hard sell on me, but they did beat Pyrrhus some 30 years later, so there must be some truth to it. But I think Caesar and Alexander did have a connection, but how much of it's true, we don't really know.
So in the Persian lands that he conquered and then going down into India, what sort of legacy would have been left there? So like you said, the Romans had a love-hate relationship with him, but lands that were lost later, I mean, did he have a positive or negative impact? Was anything similar to how the Romans felt?
With the other, maybe like the non-Greek states, we'll call them, we have a very hard time piecing together evidence. In Iran or the Iranian traditions, primarily the Zoroaster, well, there are a couple different variations of Iranian traditions. I'm using that term loosely referring to the Iranian heartland. In later sources, in romances, medieval period, where after the arrival of Islam, Alexander was a pretty fantastical figure. Nothing too hated about him. He was part of that romantic tradition that was very popular in Europe as well. Slayer of monsters. There was a talk earlier about it. So there was that's more of a positive connotation. But in the Zoroastrian tradition, the religion of a lot of the earlier Iranians, Alexander was very disliked. According to their tradition, Alexander had burned the religious texts of Zoroaster in Persepolis when he had destroyed the city, which was the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. And they terminize him, they refer to him as Alexander the Accursed, which is a really great nickname, and I really enjoy that. So compare Alexander the Great in the West to Alexander Accursed in the East. That's a very diametrically opposed viewpoint. But when you go a little bit beyond that to India, we actually don't have much of any accounts of Alexander. Unfortunately, the first written texts come later. And from the perspective of Indian history, Alexander was basically a raider. I mean, he was only in there for 1 or 2 years, attacked a very small portion of it. We do have a lot of more information about the Hellenistic kings that came afterwards. They don't make any reference to Alexander, though. They make reference to the likes of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and the Antigonids, such as the Buddhist texts of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. And we also have the Indo-Greek kings, those who had left Afghanistan, conquered into the Punjab. We have records from them, from Indian plays, from dramatics, from Buddhist texts. So there is a little bit of bleed over, but nothing really referring to Alexander, unfortunately. Now, in the modern sense, if maybe Indian nationalism, Alexander is a case where, let me take a step back and be fair. The British, the 19th century, or the late 20th century, or early 20th century, late 19th century British Empire saw Alexander as sort of a predecessor in India, and were bound to be more positively inclined. Therefore, the post-colonialist India viewed Alexander as sort of like a prototype for the British Empire, and have a much more negative connotation. And you'll sometimes see examples of the Battle of Hydaspes. It was secretly the Indian king, or the Paravan king, Porus, actually won. Well, not quite, but it clearly shows how much our perception of Alexander is influenced by modern geopolitical frameworks and situations. So, but kind of the short of it, we don't really know in ancient India, but we do have modern India, which is a little bit, I think, is interesting.
Yeah, so it seems that they're still continuing to use his image then, or his legacy.
It definitely, in the case of, for example, the most recent one I remember in terms of large-scale policy, I believe in Desert Storm, Norman Schwarzkopf, referring to the invasion of Iraq, the Gulf War, actually specifically cited Alexander as his, what do we do? We followed Alexander. I think that was a very postscript quote, but it shows that clearly, even in the late 1990s or early 1990s, we're still having these references of people following ancient doctrine invading Mesopotamia, or modern day Iraq, Iran. How well that was received in Iraq, I don't really know, but clearly it's still somebody that influences a lot of people to the present day. And it's military school. I'm not a military historian, nor have I ever been to West Point, but I'm sure that it's still pretty prominent in a lot of circles.
Yeah, definitely. Right, we've got a few minutes left. So just one more question here. What do you think it was about Alexander the Great that made him just so successful? I mean,
definitely luck is a lot of it. And that's not to just to diminish his achievements. I mean, as I showed earlier with the amount of injuries he suffered, this is a very small fraction. He had way more close calls than I could count. And a lot of other people would have been killed right in combat. I mean, the fact he threw himself so recklessly, which was part of his I guess what you call it, his plan for success, what distinguished him is just throwing himself into the front lines and targeting with his cavalry charges. That put him into a lot of danger. And as we find in the Hellenistic period, this was often imitated by the successor dynasties. but to much less, much more fatal effect. We have a couple times where these kings are killed right in combat by accident. I remember one instance of Antiochus III where he literally took a club to the face and had most of his teeth knocked out. It's stuff like that. There clearly was luck involved, but also, I mean, look at where he comes from. He's the son of the most powerful man in Greece, who had trained and built. I mean, Philip II deserves as much praise as Alexander does in why they were able to conquer the Persian Empire. They turned a backwards a group of quasi barbarians into a effective powerhouse that eventually marched all the way to India. That's no small feat, and a lot of that is tied to Philip. And Alexander was trained in the model, and he clearly did some I guess we would call it reforms, though they're not too extensive. He was adopting as he was going along. He was clearly very capable of adapting to situations. Of course, we remember the famous battles of Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, but the number of sieges he undertook and the amount of logistics is incredible. And a lot of that is tied to who he picked as his staffmen. As I mentioned previously, the successors, although they were incredibly ambitious and tarnished his image afterwards, they were incredibly successful. And kind of like Napoleon, he was surrounded by incredibly talented individuals that were able to boost him. And I don't think that's diminishes Alexander. I think it's a testament. You surround yourself with great people who can elevate what you currently do. So I think that's part of it. And I mean, he just clearly had not a death wish, but he was clearly the point of just didn't care. You're going to achieve a lot if you simply walk in with absolute 100% confidence in yourself. But it doesn't always end well, as we clearly saw in 323 when he died at 32 years old, which is exceptionally young, even for the standards of the time. Yeah,
definitely. Well, I think that's probably time now. So is there anything you'd like to plug or promote or say just before we close up?
I'd like to thank everybody for coming to visit, staying with us, or not staying, for taking the time to your day to come join us in Intelligent Speech. I thank everybody, all the staff members who were, contributing in terms of setting this all up, getting us involved, doing all the research. And I appreciate you for also hosting us, even though the awkward introduction I completely neglected. I ruined your thunder. And if you're interested in this whole period and what comes after Alexander, the Hellenistic Age Podcast is all about that. So feel free to join me. I'm available anywhere you can find your podcasts or anything like that. So I thank you all for taking your time today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Derek. And yeah, everybody go listen to his podcast. It's fantastic talk. So thank you.
Have a great one, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.